Hello, everyone. I've been asked to talk about the issue of linguistic diversity and international structures. Now, to do that, I think we have to clarify conceptually that there are two very different approaches at the international level. First of all, there is the linguistic diversity approach itself, which you find guaranteed or dealt with at the European level. But you also have conceptually a very different approach, which is not linguistic diversity per se, but the human rights approach, where you can actually have some human rights obligations that deal with language indirectly, because the focus of human rights are actually individuals and not languages per se. Now, let me explain by giving the example of the Council of Europe. The Council of Europe actually has two treaties that touch upon language. And the differences are based on this conceptual approach, or differences. The first treaty to mention is the Framework Convention on the Protection of National Minorities, which actually has quite a few provisions which deal with language, including the use of a minority's language in education. Now, the Framework Convention is actually a human rights document. Its main interest is not actually linguistic diversity, but individuals, minorities, or individuals who belong to minorities, including to linguistic minorities. Next to the Framework Convention, there's another Council of Europe treaty, and that is the European Charter for Regional or Minority Languages. And that is actually a linguistic diversity treaty. So this explains conceptually why the Council of Europe, we actually have two structures, two legal documents, two legally binding treaties that deal with the two conceptual approaches. The human rights approach, which recognizes rights for individuals based on the human rights of national minorities, including linguistic minorities. And then the European Charter, which is a linguistic diversity document, which does not recognize any individual or even collective right, but only recognizes obligations on states to protect and promote the linguistic diversity in Europe. Now, at the international level, particularly at the United Nations, let me be clear. We have no legally binding document, not even, in fact, a declaration even, which is a political statement, at the United Nations on linguistic diversity per se. We do have, however, legally binding documents with a human rights approach, including the Declaration on the Rights of National or Linguistic, Ethnic, and Religious Minorities, which deal with the individual human rights of minorities, including in the area of language. And there are quite a few provisions, human rights provisions, including the prohibition of discrimination, which can protect indirectly languages. But we have to be quite clear, the focus of these human rights documents is not linguistic diversity itself, but human rights obligations that protect, in some cases, linguistic minorities in the use of language, which can indirectly have a favorable, a positive impact on linguistic diversity. Now, because of these conceptual differences, which is not always completely appreciated, I think we have to recognize the limitations, if you will, of a human rights approach. Because human rights are not focused on or actually intended to deal with linguistic diversity, my question to you as students would be to consider whether a human rights approach can be effective, can be used actually to try to protect our linguistic diversity. And if so, what are the strength and the limits of such an approach? And I think that's these are two important dimensions. A human rights approach, can it be really effective for linguistic diversity and for some languages? And if they are to be effective, what kind of conditions? Can they really be useful for the vast majority of languages? Does it depend on the size or number of speakers of a language for a human rights approach to be useful? And perhaps you can consider concrete case studies of a particular linguistic minority and wonder whether this can be useful in that particular case, and perhaps look at it also for a more strategic point of view in terms of effective use of various tools that might be possible. Thank you, and good luck.